I don't know if you remember Rishi Sunak's opening speech when we talked on the programme for about an hour and a half about the importance of optimism in politics and the possibility of the grown-ups having returned to the room. In retrospect, it was an incredibly naive, not to mention ridiculous perspective to take, and he almost immediately gave the lie to any hope that he was about to embark upon a different course by bringing Suella Braverman back into the cabinet, a woman whose name became a byword for everything, really, that was wrong with the last several administrations. And I'm reminding you of that because I am slightly conscious of what we could call Idiot's Corner. I wanted Rishi Sunak to be good because I'm a patriotic resident of this country, and by patriotic I simply mean I want what's best for myself, my family and my fellow citizens. So I remind you of that because I feel like that again today, even though Keir Starmer is from a very different political party, from the most different political party. And I feel like the grown-ups have returned to the room. I've wondered for some time what would happen if a Prime Minister used a public address to talk the country through what was happening and what was needed. The difference between fixing the foundations as a slogan on the front of a podium, a lectern, and stop the boats could not be more acute. I fully appreciate many people are concerned about stopping the boats, but the idea that that would be the overarching mission of a government that has responsibility for our health, for our education, for our defence, for our environment, for farming, for trade, for business. The idea that the overarching obsession, the key mission, the defining statement of an entire government could be stop the boats was a moment of epic national tragedy, I felt, and spoke to precisely the points that Keir Starmer has just been making. It spoke to an addiction to making promises that couldn't be kept, or to thinking that you could solve complicated problems with simple pledges. He said, I think the line I enjoyed the most, we have to end the politics of the easy answer that solves nothing. And he provided the detail. He referenced the OBR, the Office of Budget Responsibility, and the quite correct claim that the £22 billion hole in the public finances was not expected. There's some dispute over how much was expected. The Institute of Fiscal Studies had essentially warned that there could be a shortfall of between 10 and 20 billion pounds. But if you take their lowest prediction, that's £12 billion more that they have to find, that they were charged with finding the minute that they got into Downing Street. And he set out some of the ways in which he intends to do it. Let me read you some of the texts that have come in while he was speaking. I'll just read them randomly. Is it just me, James, or do you struggle to take seriously any of the Tory protests about standards in number 10, the economy, tax, honesty? The barefaced hypocrisy is extraordinary. I thought he handled that very well. I haven't really followed the Wahid Ali story, the TV and business executive who was a fundraiser for the Labour Party and had a pass into Downing Street last month while he was also, I think, organising a party for other fundraisers. So as far as I could tell, everyone's getting their knickers in the twist about the fact that he had access to the barbecue in the Downing Street garden. And the people telling you to get your knickers in the twist were the ones that were supremely relaxed about Boris Johnson putting the son of a KGB spy, now sanctioned in many countries, the father, the spy, into the actual House of Lords. So I think that's what Alan is referring to. Loz says, this is the sort of candour that will win people over. If he wants us to believe again, he needs to keep this energy going. Brilliant speech, giving me some hope. That's Paul in Crowborough. Ian says, I'm loving this. This one is unsigned. This man needs someone to advise him to stop pouring fuel on the fire. Utterly inept, referring, I presume, to the rioters and the idea that we should be somehow seeking to appease racist thugs trying to burn down hotels and attack our police officers. VM similarly unimpressed by elements of it, although perhaps a little more intelligently. Utter rubbish that rioters were exploiting and gaming the Tories' failed system. That would credit them with joined-up thinking and critical thinking skills that they don't have. They rioted because they're a bunch of thugs who'd been whipped up by 10 years of Tory divisive rhetoric and a host of right-wing media shock jocks and social media extremists. It's something I would largely agree with, although I'd also remind you that what he said about prisons, what he repeatedly said about prisons, probably lies at the heart of what you might describe as his political mission. Ian Dunt puts it well on social media this morning. A situation, think about this, take this on board, a situation where the Prime Minister is having to check prison places daily during riots is symptomatic of an utterly broken country. The sheer scale of his inheritance, the damage that Keir Starmer has inherited, is something that you obviously know a lot about because we talked about it throughout. But the sleight of hand, the pulling of wool over the eyes that the entire leadership election panel remain dedicated to is really a reiteration of the idea that you look at a country where a government has responsibility for defence, for health, for education, for the environment, for farming, for business, for trade. What else can we put on that list? There'll be things I've forgotten that you're cross about. All of the things that a government has responsibility for, and the current iteration of the Tory party, because they live in perpetual fear of parties growing up to the right of them. They think the single most important priority in the country is stopping the boats. So there it is. That is why we've ended up in a place where the actual Prime Minister is having to check prison places on a daily basis during vicious riots in order to be confident that he can actually, or that the people pleading guilty to these hideous crimes because they were too stupid to realise that filming themselves committing them might be a rather compelling case for the prosecution to make sure that there is actually room to lock them up. I'm captivated by this speech, says Kevin. Starmer has such a tough gig, but I sincerely trust that he can turn this tanker full of skip fires away from the cliffs. A master of the analogy there, Kevin, a man after my own heart. It's the first time in a long time that I've heard a cogent plan and believed it. If Sunak, Johnson and the rest were the e-scooters of government, Starmer is the Austin Metro. I think maybe just doubling down on the king. His mastery of analogies, and he's clearly worked on his delivery too. Sue's not sure. She says, listening to Keir Starmer, I'm sure he will do good, but it's so boring, all doom and gloom and little hope, unlike Kamala Harris in the United States. Although, Sue, I have to tell you, she's been criticised for a lack of substance. And, of course, she's not in power. You can campaign in poetry, but you have to govern in prose. And in many ways, you're complaining that Keir Starmer today was communicating to you in prose and not poetry. Call me naive, says Jennifer in Stilton, but this is for the first time in a very long time. I believe and feel trust in our Prime Minister. Jamie says that was actually quite good, very scathing of the failures of the Tories. And Eric goes further. After listening to the Prime Minister's speech, whatever he needs to fix the country, I will stand behind him. I need to find a few more negative ones, but they have to be vaguely sensible. They can't be, as Mr. P described, the usual suspects queuing up to sling mud at him. Because I am allowing myself this morning to be optimistic. And I am conscious that the hope of improvement will have to endure and contain things getting worse before they get better, as the song didn't say. It's never going to catch on, is it? Oasis might be getting back together, but this is not 1997. Things can only get worse before they get better. And that, I realise, was the speech I've been waiting, I think, over 10 years for a British Prime Minister to deliver. And I just remind you again, before you waste tuppence accusing me of footballification or client journalism or all the other things that we used to point out happening when the various lies and atrocities were being committed on the country by the last several governments. I said the same thing for about an hour and a half about Rishi Sunak. And I have in the past been more than happy to castigate leaders of the Labour Party. I'm responding entirely to one man, one speech, one government and one vision. And I really, really like what I see. And I can't articulate to you how weird that feels. I can't articulate to you how scared I am even to say those words out loud. How many times have we referenced that brilliant line in the film, the John Cleese film Clockwise, about it being the hope that gets you? I can cope with the despair. I can cope with the despair. It's the hope that gets you. And there hasn't been any hope. You've got people prominent on the political stage dedicated to breaking things. the equivalent, if you like, of the Farage rioters, the people who have gone from setting fire to our membership of the European Union and now want to set fire to our membership of the European Convention on Human Rights, to bring us down to the level of Russia and Belarus. And we have had government after government after government who were dedicating all of their energies to appeasing people like that. Keir Starmer barely acknowledged their existence today because he was busy talking about apprentices. And he was busy talking about firefighters and police officers and doctors and nurses and healthcare professionals and you and me and people that actually want to be governed, who don't wake up every morning gnashing their teeth about the possibility of some desperate soul launching a dinghy from Calais in the hope of arriving in Dover and almost certainly, according to all statistical evidence, having an asylum application that is entirely justified. He talked about fixing the foundations. He talked about unpopular decisions. He talked about building 1.5 million new homes. He talked about ending strikes that had crippled the country for years. He talked about setting up Great British Energy. He talked about having done more in 7 weeks than 7 years. And I felt with every sentence, with every paragraph, I felt a little bit of my determination to come back from the speech cynically and sceptically and throwing rotten tomatoes at the Prime Minister. I felt it seeping away. I don't like the winter fuel decision. I don't like means testing in general. I don't like it in particular if, as is predicted, it's going to hurt some of the more vulnerable, some of the most vulnerable people in our society. But I'm not taking lectures on how bad a policy it is from the people who presided over an economy that necessitated the invention of warm banks. And the idea that anybody involved in the last several governments has any leg, any limb to stand on when it comes to criticising Keir Starmer for choosing people he believes are best capable of absorbing the financial penalty of losing a benefit it's palpably absurd. I thought the questions from the media were really interesting. They weren't quite sure where to go because it was as if a headmaster had delivered a speech about school curriculum policies, and therefore they can only really ask questions about school curriculum policies. They can't ask stupid questions about the latest populist snake oil that's being set up by various politicians who were more concerned with their own leadership ambitions than they were with the actual state of the nation. And that's the phrase we keep coming back to. The state of the nation. I wrote a book called How They Broke Britain, right? I wrote, and you know, it details, in some cases forensically, a lot of the reasons behind and causes of the malaise that Keir Starmer describes. It doesn't go in hard on prisons, but it looks at how austerity combined with populism, combined with utterly inadequate politicians up to and including the status, the position of Prime Minister, all congregated in the same space to create a country that was surreally divided between those of us who could see what was going on, those of us who have been supremely unsurprised to discover that the prisons are utterly unfit for purpose, and those who've been insisting for years that everything's absolutely brilliant and Boris Johnson is the finest Prime Minister this country has ever seen, or that Liz Truss was more sinned against than sinning. And although he rightly laid out the charges against his predecessors, laid out the charges against the Tories, that was a speech from a Prime Minister who's got 4 or 5 years ahead of him to at least begin to do the things that he is promising to do. It was not a speech from a Prime Minister who's worried about an attack from his own front bench, who's worried about a leadership challenge or demands from a congregation of backbenchers that you hit the road sooner rather than later. That was a boring speech by a boring man dealing with the boring business of getting Britain back on its feet. And if you don't like that, you don't like Britain. If you don't want him to succeed, you don't want Britain to succeed. You can't possibly argue with the diagnosis of a country on its knees. You can argue with the prescription, such that he has provided, and we'll have to wait until the budget to find out more, but you cannot argue with the diagnosis of a country on its knees unless you are truly deluded or incredibly wealthy. Unless you are so insulated from the realities of what's happening in the NHS, what's happening in the education system, what's happening in trade. There's stuff he didn't say that I would have liked to have seen. can tell Keith thinks I've gone on a bit because he just turned up the music in the background. I would have liked a little more on Brexit. I don't understand how you can talk about a £22 billion deficit without acknowledging the role that Brexit has played in robbing our businesses of the opportunity to trade easily with many of our partners. But I wasn't sure what I was going to do this morning. I wasn't sure what he was going to say, and I wasn't sure whether I was going to allow my natural cynicism to overcome my natural optimism. I'm not. I think that was absolutely marvellous. And it is a very, very long time since I have felt that we have someone in the driving seat of this country who actually has a bloody licence. The key thing that struck me was the words on the lectern: fixing the foundations, replacing, stop the boats. And the second thing that struck me was the conduct of your colleagues, the questions, which had to be, as a consequence of the content of the speech, had to be quite substantive. There wasn't the front page hunting that has typified these sort of moments for the last few years. The journalists, whether they were supportive of the government or not, trying to get a gotcha or trying to get a scoop. So it was an oddly sober affair, I felt.
I think that's fair. Look, it's his first, obviously, speech back in Downing Street as he tries to sort of mark the new year in government. We're expecting MPs back in Westminster next week. So it is trying to set up, I think, for him, the scale of the challenge ahead. That was very clear. And obviously, what he really wanted to talk about was what this means in terms of the legacy of the last government and how high he believes that challenge is going to be to get rid of what he believes would be 14 years of Conservative rot.
When there's a deep rot at the heart of a structure, you can't just cover it up. You can't just tinker or rely on quick fixes. You have to overhaul the entire thing. Tackle it at root, even if it's harder work and takes more time. Because otherwise, what happens? The rot returns in all the same places, and it spreads worse than before.
In fairness, James, I think it actually reminded me in some ways of some of the things that I think Rishi Sunak tried to say at the start of when he became Prime Minister, obviously overtaken by events. But
in the reappointment of Suella Braverman 2 or 3 hours later, which gave knocked the gloss off all of his promises of change. But yes, I said that oddly at the outset.
What I mean by that is, Rishi Sunak talking about making the difficult long-term decisions for the future because they're the right decisions. That's what Keir Starmer, I think, was trying to do with his speech, talking about how the government will do that hard work. And obviously he talked about the riots and made that a huge metaphor of this speech, talking about the idea of the clear up being a clear part of what the solution is going to be.
Would we have had the speech without the riots?
I think potentially, yes, but maybe it wouldn't have framed the speech in quite the way that I think it did. But yes, I think the riots was obviously that metaphor. He wants to try and clean up the country, and he believes that it's going to take quite a long time to do that.
We've also seen shocking scenes across the nation. A mindless minority of thugs who thought that they could get away with causing chaos, smashing up communities and terrifying minorities, vandalising and destroying people's property, even trying to set fire to a building with human beings inside it. And as if that wasn't despicable enough, people displaying swastika tattoos, shouting racist slurs on our streets, Nazi salutes at the cenotaph. The cenotaph, the very place we honour those who gave their lives for this country, desecrating their memory under the pretence, and it is a pretence, of legitimate protest. Now they're learning that crime has consequences, that I won't tolerate a breakdown in law and order under any circumstances.
That was a pretty interesting line from Keir Starmer, wasn't it? Obviously, you would expect the former director of public prosecution to say something like that, but it's clear that law and order and crime is going to be a really big part of now his tenure in Downing Street, and potentially, not saying it wasn't important before, but the summer of unrest has made that something that needs to be at the forefront of his mind. But I think that the stark headlines that we're going to see in tomorrow's papers, James, are going to be all about the budget, isn't it? About those painful decisions that he says are going to have to come down the track. And he's talking about how those with the broad broadest shoulders need to bear that burden, talking about the winter fuel allowance, which we know he's going to scrap for millions of pensioners as well, saying that's the thing that he needs to do if he needs to make those political choices to put more money into the NHS, to schools, to give kids the life chances that he says they need. He's going to have to take some of those difficult decisions to take money away from pensioners. And, he was quizzed on the idea that he is making political choices at the moment. And I think when MPs come back next week, we will see a little bit more from MPs about how they really feel about some of these political choices. The idea of giving, some people say, bigger pay rises to some of the unions.
Some of the workers.
Sure, but also giving doctors different pay rises to train drivers, and he's making those political choices. And I think a lot of people are going to have something to say about that, and have something to say about the idea, whether you agree with it or not, about taking money off pensioners, to give pay rises, to put money into other areas, to put VAT on private school fees, all of those things. Those are the choices he's going to have to make.
That's the ankle, isn't it? Whether it's an Achilles heel or not, time will tell. But it was interesting how many of the questions went in on that. And I've heard people who know what they're talking about contending that there's a U-turn on the way. I think he probably gave the lie to that prospect, at least in the short to middle term.
Well, he did say that he is going to be looking at ways to, I can't remember what the phrase was, it's something like mitigate the impacts of the winter fuel allowance. And I spoke to somebody in government today who, there is a report in the Financial Times today that says they could be extending what's called the Household Support Budget Fund. That, I'm told by government sources, is being considered. So there could be some mitigating impacts to try and soften the blow a bit. But the Prime Minister said mitigations. That's going to get all of us looking at what else could potentially be done. There was an idea that they could potentially stagger some of those payments in order to give it a little bit of a taper, to give it off, to try and...
Which is always the sort of holy grail when you're doing means testing.
Exactly.
The taper is sadly often more expensive than the money that it would redistribute. And that's the point, isn't it? I mean, that's a political decision that many of his own members, many of his own MPs won't like. But
and Number 10 are very aware and I think alive to that. There are definitely people in government who are worried that this could be something that they could have to move on.
It's still politics, as we haven't seen for a long time. It's not a slogan. It's a deliberate attempt to take money from this constituency of people and put it there instead, because the finances are not infinite. It's not rhetoric. It's not sloganeering. It's the politics of detail, and that's, I think, what I found refreshing about the entire speech. And of course, as many of my texters are pointing out, pensioners are going to be treated by the doctors who have just received a sort of morale-boosting pay rise.
He wanted to make that case, didn't he? He wanted to sit there and say, actually, look, this is the political choices, but pensioners use all of these public services too, and they are all vital to our future. So yes, but I think the honeymoon for Keir Starmer is going to come to an end, I think, in the next few weeks, in terms of his own MPs starting to pile a little bit more pressure on some of these decisions that he's making.
Splendid, thank you.